At the podium in the East Room of the White House, my mother, Patricia Morgan, stood frozen as the President of the United States placed the Congressional Medal of Honor around my neck. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she watched the same daughter she had called damaged goods receive the nation's highest military honor. The same daughter she had told to stop playing victim about my war injuries. The same daughter she had forbidden from attending family gatherings because my prosthetic leg made guests uncomfortable. But what she didn't know was that this moment wasn't just about military valor. Hidden in my dress blues was a recording device, and sitting in the audience was a journalist who had been investigating our family's darkest secret for months. The medal ceremony wasn't just my vindication, it was the beginning of her reckoning. My name is Haley Morgan. I'm 27 years old, and this is the story of how my own family tried to bury me alive, not knowing they were creating the very weapon that would expose their lies to the world. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was in my small apartment in Virginia Beach, the kind of place where the walls are thin enough to hear your neighbor's every conversation and the heating system sounds like a dying animal. The caller ID showed Mom, but I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken in 8 months, not since the incident at my cousin Rachel's wedding. Haley, my mother's voice was crisp, businesslike, no greeting, no pleasantries. Your father is dead. The words hit me like shrapnel, not because I was devastated. My father, Robert Morgan, and I had been strangers long before I enlisted, but because of what came next. The funeral is Thursday, private service, family only. A pause, and then the knife twists. You're not welcome. I sat up in bed, my prosthetic leg leaning against the nightstand where I'd left it. I'm his daughter, Mom. You stopped being his daughter the day you chose that life, she said, her voice dripping with the same disgust she'd perfected over the years. You made your bed when you decided to play soldier. Don't expect us to hold your hand through the consequences. The line went dead. I stared at my phone in the darkness, feeling that familiar hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't a surprise. I had learned long ago not to expect anything from Patricia Morgan, but sitting there in the pre-dawn quiet, with the phantom pain shooting through my missing leg, I realized something had shifted. The hurt that usually accompanied her cruelty had been replaced by something colder, sharper, something that felt almost like clarity. Robert Morgan's obituary ran in the Chicago Tribune 3 days later. It was a masterpiece of selective memory, painting him as a devoted family man and successful real estate mogul. It mentioned his surviving wife, Patricia, his son Marcus, and his daughter Jessica. I wasn't listed. According to the public record, I didn't exist. But I did exist, and I had spent the last 2 years learning exactly how much power an invisible person could wield. The morning after the funeral I wasn't invited to, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my kitchen, struggling with the coffee maker, a daily battle when you're learning to navigate the world with one leg, when someone knocked on my door. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. Ms. Morgan, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm a journalist with the Washington Herald. I opened the door cautiously, my military training automatically assessing potential threats. But Sarah's demeanor was gentle, respectful. I've been researching a story about Morgan Development Corporation, about some irregularities in their government contracts. Your name came up in some old records. Morgan Development was my family's company, the source of their wealth and influence. My grandfather had started it in the 1960s, and my father had built it into a multi-million-dollar operation specializing in military housing contracts. I don't know anything about the business, I said, which was mostly true. I'd been shut out of family affairs long before my deployment. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Ms. Morgan, I think you should know. There's evidence that your family has been defrauding the Department of Defense for years. Substandard materials in military housing, falsified safety inspections, kickbacks to procurement officers. We're talking about housing that's been putting service members and their families at risk. The irony was staggering. While I was overseas getting my leg blown off defending my country, my family was back home stealing from it. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because, Sarah said carefully, some of the documents I found suggest you were supposed to be listed as a beneficiary in certain contracts, but your name was removed from all corporate documents right after your injury. It's like they erased you completely. I invited her in and made coffee with shaking hands. As Sarah spread documents across my small dining table, a picture emerged that made my stomach turn. Not only had my family built their fortune on fraud, but they had systematically removed any trace of my connection to the company the moment I became inconvenient, the moment I came home wounded. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling out a folder marked confidential. I've been trying to verify the circumstances of your injury. The official report says IED explosion, convoy escort mission, but I found some discrepancies. She showed me a series of documents, deployment records, incident reports, commendation recommendations that had been mysteriously withdrawn. My hands trembled as I recognized the patterns of bureaucratic manipulation. Someone has been actively suppressing information about your service record, Sarah continued, blocking medal recommendations, reassigning personnel who were witnesses to your actions. It's like someone wanted to ensure your military service looked as unremarkable as possible. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. My mother's connections, her charity work with military families, the way she'd always seemed to know more about my deployment than she should have. She hadn't just disowned me, she had actively worked to diminish my service record. Ms. Morgan, I think your family didn't just erase you from their company. I think they tried to erase you from history entirely. That night, alone in my apartment, with Sarah's documents spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, I made a decision. For too long, I had let my family's rejection define me. I had believed their narrative, that I was broken, that my injuries made me less than whole, that I was somehow to blame for the pain that had befallen me. But as I read through the suppressed witness statements describing my actions on that convoy, how I had dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety despite my own devastating injuries, how I had held off insurgents for 20 minutes until reinforcements arrived, how I had saved 7 lives while nearly losing my own, I realized something profound. I wasn't the damaged one in this family. I was the threat. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meeting tomorrow. Bring everything Sarah gave you. It's time you knew the whole truth about what happened over there. Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, Pentagon. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Rodriguez had been mentioned in some of Sarah's documents, an officer who had tried to recommend me for commendation multiple times, only to have his requests mysteriously denied or delayed. The next morning, I drove to a small diner in Arlington where Rodriguez was waiting. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform. When he saw me approach, aided by my walking cane, his expression tightened with what looked like anger. "Sergeant Morgan," he said, standing to shake my hand, or should I say, hero. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside were documents I had never seen, the original reports from my deployment, unedited witness statements, and a recommendation for the Congressional Medal of Honor that had been submitted immediately after my injury. "Your actions that day saved 7 American lives," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You held off an entire insurgent cell while evacuating wounded soldiers, despite having your leg nearly severed by shrapnel. You refused medical evacuation until every other soldier was safe. It was the kind of heroism that defines what it means to serve this country." I stared at the Medal of Honor recommendation, dated just 3 weeks after my injury. Why wasn't I told about this? Rodriguez's jaw clenched. Because someone made calls. Someone with connections high up in the Department of Defense. Someone who convinced people that pursuing your commendation would be problematic, that it would bring unwanted attention to certain contracts and relationships. The room seemed to tilt. My mother. Patricia Morgan sits on the board of 3 military contractor associations. She's donated millions to campaigns of key defense committee members. When she decided you were a liability, she had the power to make sure your heroism stayed buried. Rodriguez leaned forward, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. But here's what she didn't count on, Sergeant. The truth has a way of surfacing. The soldiers you saved, they never forgot. They've been fighting to get your story told for 2 years. And now, with this fraud investigation, everything is coming to light. He pulled out one final document, a new Medal of Honor recommendation, signed by every soldier I had saved, endorsed by their commanding officers, and backed by irrefutable evidence. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The ceremony is in 6 weeks, Rodriguez said. The president himself will present it. Your family will be invited, as is protocol, and this time there's nothing they can do to stop it. I looked at the document through tears I didn't realize I was shedding. For 2 years, I had believed I was nothing more than a broken soldier, discarded by my family and forgotten by my country. But I wasn't broken. I was a decorated war hero whose own family had conspired to steal not just my inheritance, but my honor. As I left the diner that day, walking slowly but steadily toward my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Not the kind that comes from money or influence, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth. And soon, the whole world would know it too. The war my family thought they had won was just beginning. Growing up in the Morgan household was like living in a museum dedicated to perfection. Our estate in Lake Forest, Illinois, was a sprawling testament to old money and newer ambitions, with manicured gardens that cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. Every room was designed to impress, from the marble foyer with its crystal chandelier imported from Austria to the library lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read. My mother, Patricia, ruled this domain with the precision of a military general and the warmth of a corporate boardroom. She was the kind of woman who scheduled spontaneous, who turned charity work into a competitive sport, and who could destroy someone's reputation with a perfectly timed smile and a whispered word at the country club. Her background was modest. She'd grown up in a working-class family in Ohio, but she had spent decades perfecting the art of belonging among people who had never known want. My father, Robert, was her perfect complement. He had inherited Morgan Development from his father, but had tripled its size through a combination of legitimate business acumen and what I would later learn were decidedly less legitimate practices. He was the kind of man who wore custom suits to breakfast and considered a handshake legally binding, at least when it served his purposes. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who employed hundreds and donated generously to veteran causes. The irony of that last part would become clear later. Then there was Marcus, my older brother, who had inherited all of my father's ambition and none of his intelligence. Marcus was 2 years older than me and had spent his entire life coasting on the family name and the expectation that he would one day take over Morgan Development. He had the kind of effortless charm that opened doors and closed deals, but underneath it was a laziness so profound it was almost impressive. He'd been expelled from 2 prep schools for academic dishonesty, barely scraped through college despite expensive tutoring, and had somehow landed a VP position at the company at age 25 without ever holding another job. Jessica, my younger sister, was the family's masterpiece. 3 years younger than me, she had been groomed from birth to be the perfect daughter, beautiful, accomplished, compliant. She played piano at a concert level, spoke 3 languages, and had never received a grade lower than an A-. Where I had always been curious, questioning, drawn to challenges, Jessica had learned early to smile, agree, and excel within carefully defined boundaries. She was everything my parents wanted in a daughter, which made my own defiance all the more glaring by comparison. I was the anomaly, the glitch in their perfect system. From childhood, I had been drawn to things that made my mother wince: building treehouse forts instead of playing with dolls, reading military history instead of fashion magazines, and asking uncomfortable questions about why our family's construction company always seemed to win government contracts. I was athletic when they wanted refined, curious when they wanted compliant, independent when they wanted controllable. The first crack in our family facade appeared when I was 16. It was a humid summer evening, and we were hosting one of my mother's elaborate dinner parties for potential investors. The guest of honor was General Harrison Webb, a Pentagon procurement officer whose approval could make or break military contractors. I had been recruited to play the role of the charming daughter, to smile prettily and make small talk about school and my plans for college. But as the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, General Webb began talking more openly about the challenges facing military families, about substandard housing on bases, about contractors cutting corners to maximize profits. I listened with growing horror as he described families living in homes with faulty wiring, toxic mold, and heating systems that failed in winter, all while contractors collected millions in fees. "It's criminal what some of these companies get away with," Webb said, his voice slurred with alcohol and frustration. "We have oversight, of course, but paperwork can be adjusted. Inspections can be expedited. As long as the right people are kept happy, if you know what I mean." I watched my father and Webb exchange a look across the table, a moment of understanding that made my stomach turn. Later that night, after the guests had left, I confronted my father in his study. "Are you talking about our company?" I asked directly. "Are we one of the contractors cutting corners?" My father looked up from his brandy with the expression of a man dealing with an irritating interruption. "You're too young to understand business, Haley. Sometimes compromises have to be made to stay competitive." "Compromises?" I said, my voice rising. He was talking about families living in dangerous conditions. "He was talking about the realities of government contracting," my father replied coldly, "and it's none of your concern." But it was my concern, and I made the mistake of saying so. Over the following weeks, I began paying attention to things I had previously ignored: the hushed phone conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the documents my father kept in his locked filing cabinet, the way certain government officials were treated like visiting royalty at our house. I started researching Morgan development online, reading news articles about military housing, cross-referencing contract awards with safety violations. What I found was a pattern of winning bids with suspiciously low costs, followed by change orders that inflated the final prices, often for housing that later faced safety complaints. When I brought my findings to my mother, expecting her to share my horror, I discovered the true nature of our family dynamics. We were in her sitting room, a space decorated in soft pastels that had always felt like a sanctuary. I spread the printouts across her antique writing desk, explaining what I discovered, waiting for her to realize the implications. Instead, she calmly gathered the papers and fed them into her personal shredder. "You will not embarrass this family with your conspiracy theories," she said, her voice calm but deadly. "Your father has built something important here. He employs 300 people. He supports this community. And you want to tear it all down because of what? Some complaints from soldiers who don't understand the complexities of construction?" "Mom, people could get hurt," I said, stunned by her reaction. "People get hurt in all kinds of ways, Haley," she replied, returning to her correspondence as if I weren't there. "They get hurt when their fathers lose their businesses, when their families lose their homes, when ungrateful children destroy everything their parents have worked to build." The message was clear. My concerns didn't matter. My conscience was a luxury the family couldn't afford. The situation escalated when I made the fatal error of confiding in Marcus. We were in the pool house one afternoon, and I thought I could appeal to whatever decency might exist beneath his privileged exterior. I explained what I'd learned, hoping he might use his position in the company to push for changes. Marcus listened with growing amusement, and when I finished, he actually laughed. "Jesus, Haley, you really think you're some kind of crusader, don't you?" he said, taking a long drink from his beer. "You want to know the truth? Yeah, we cut corners. Everyone does. The Pentagon knows it, the generals know it, hell, the soldiers know it. It's how the game is played." "But the safety violations are managed," he interrupted.
Dad's got relationships. Problems get fixed when they need to be fixed. No one's actually getting hurt.
How can you be sure? Marcus's amusement faded, replaced by something colder. Because if they were, it would be bad for business, and nothing matters more to this family than the business. Not your feelings, not your conscience, and certainly not your juvenile sense of justice. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. And Haley, if you're thinking about taking this outside the family, you should know that Dad's already talked to some people. Your little research project didn't go unnoticed. There are ways to make troublemakers disappear from government databases, to make sure their future opportunities become very limited. Think about that before you decide to be a hero. That night, lying in my bed in the house that fraud had built, I understood something fundamental about my family. They weren't just willing to compromise their integrity for money, they were willing to destroy anyone who threatened their system, including their own daughter. The final revelation came 3 months later, when I discovered that my trust fund, the college money my grandfather had set aside for me, had been quietly transferred to cover cost overruns on a military housing project in Colorado. The project where, according to news reports I found buried in local papers, several families had been hospitalized for carbon monoxide poisoning due to faulty ventilation systems. My college fund had literally been used to pay for housing that was poisoning soldiers' families. When I confronted my parents about the missing money, my mother's response was swift and brutal. "Consider it payment for the damage you've already caused this family," she said. "Your behavior these past months has been unacceptable. The questions, the accusations, the complete lack of loyalty. We've decided you need to learn some perspective." "You stole my college money," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We redirected resources to where they were needed most," my father corrected from behind his newspaper. "If you want a college education, you'll have to find another way to pay for it. Perhaps that will teach you the value of the money you've been so eager to criticize." Standing in that pristine living room, surrounded by furniture and art paid for with blood money, I felt something inside me break. Not my spirit, that would prove harder to destroy than they imagined, but my last remaining connection to the people I had once called family. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I walked to the military recruitment office in downtown Chicago and enlisted in the Army. If my family wanted to profit from soldiers' suffering, I would stand with those soldiers instead. What I didn't know then was that enlisting wouldn't free me from my family's influence. It would just give them new and more devastating ways to hurt me. The night I enlisted, I made the mistake of thinking the hardest part was over. I was 18, furious, and convinced that walking away from the Morgan family's blood money made me righteous. I thought cutting ties would be clean, surgical, and final. I had no idea that leaving my family wouldn't stop them from orchestrating my destruction from afar. Basic training at Fort Benning was exactly what I needed: brutal, demanding, and refreshingly honest. For the first time in my life, I was judged purely on my performance, not my last name, or my trust fund, or my mother's social connections. When Drill Sergeant Martinez screamed at me for taking too long on the obstacle course, it wasn't personal politics, it was just business. When I excelled at marksmanship or tactical planning, the praise was earned, not given. But even in the Georgia heat, surrounded by fellow recruits who had their own reasons for joining up, I couldn't completely escape the long reach of my family's influence. It started small: letters from home that never came, care packages that somehow got lost in mail processing, phone privileges that seemed to mysteriously disappear just when I'd earned them. I didn't think much of it at first. My family had made their position clear, and I assumed this was just their way of emphasizing my exile. But then I began to notice other things. My background check, which should have been routine for someone with no criminal record, took months longer than normal. My security clearance application was delayed repeatedly, always for vague procedural reasons that no one could adequately explain. Most telling of all, requests for leave to attend my grandfather's funeral were denied, not because of my performance or unit needs, but because of family situation complications that appeared in my file from unknown sources.
They weren't just disowning me, they were actively sabotaging my military career. The realization hit home during advanced individual training at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I had tested into military intelligence, scoring in the top 5% on every aptitude exam. The work suited me, analyzing data, identifying patterns, connecting dots that others missed. It was the same skill set that had led me to uncover my family's fraud, but now I was using it to serve something larger than myself. My training officer, Captain Torres, was a sharp woman in her early 30s who had earned her rank through competence rather than connections. She pulled me aside one afternoon after a particularly successful briefing exercise. "Morgan," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. Is there something in your background that I should know about? Something that might affect your clearance?" I told her everything about my family's business, about the confrontations, about my decision to enlist. I expected understanding, maybe even admiration for choosing principle over privilege. Instead, Captain Torres looked troubled.
That explains some things, she said quietly. Your file has been flagged multiple times by different review boards. Nothing official, nothing you could appeal, but enough to raise questions. Someone with influence has been making calls about you. The next day, my posting orders came through. Instead of the intelligence assignment I'd trained for, I was being transferred to a forward operating base in Afghanistan as convoy security. It was grunt work, dangerous and far from the analytical role I'd prepared for. When I tried to appeal the assignment, I was told that my psychological evaluation had raised concerns about authority issues and family loyalty conflicts. I had never undergone any such evaluation. The deployment to Afghanistan should have been my chance to prove myself, to show that I could serve with honor regardless of my family's opinion of me. Forward Operating Base Chapman was a dusty, wind-scoured collection of prefab buildings and concrete barriers in the eastern provinces, where the Taliban presence was strong and American convoys were prime targets. The work was exactly as dangerous as advertised, escorting supply trucks through mountain passes where insurgents could strike from any direction, knowing that every trip outside the wire might be your last. But I threw myself into it with the fervor of someone who had something to prove. I studied every intelligence briefing, memorized every route, and learned to read the landscape for signs of trouble. My teammates began to trust my instincts, and my squad leader, Sergeant Williams, started putting me in leadership positions despite my relatively junior rank. That's when the letters started arriving. The first one came 3 months into my deployment. It was addressed in my mother's elegant handwriting, and I almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity won out. Inside was a newspaper clipping, a society page photo of Jessica at some charity gala, radiant in a designer gown, with a caption praising her dedication to supporting military families. Attached was a handwritten note in my mother's perfect script. Some people serve their country through sacrifice. Others serve through selfishness. We know which one you chose. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This one contained a photo of Marcus cutting the ribbon at a new Morgan development facility, with a headline about the company's record-breaking contract to provide safe, affordable housing for military personnel. The note read, "Your brother is making a real difference in soldiers' lives. What are you accomplishing besides playing dress-up in the desert?" But it was the third letter that broke something inside me. It arrived on a day when our convoy had been hit by an IED buried in the road. No one was seriously hurt, but the truck I was riding in had been peppered with shrapnel, and I'd spent the afternoon digging metal fragments out of my gear. I was exhausted, rattled, and homesick despite everything. The envelope contained a single photograph, my childhood bedroom, now converted into what appeared to be a home office. All traces of my existence had been erased. The trophies from academic competitions, the photos from school events, the bookshelf I'd built with my own hands. It was as if I had never lived there at all. The note was shorter than the others. "This is what happens to daughters who choose strangers over family. You wanted to be forgotten. Congratulations." I sat on my bunk that night, staring at the photo of my erased room, and felt something fundamental shift inside me.
The hurt I'd been carrying for months crystallized into something harder, colder. They hadn't just rejected me, they had systematically worked to destroy my opportunities, undermine my service, and now they were taunting me with my isolation. They were treating my military service like a personal insult, as if my choice to serve was somehow an attack on them. That night, I wrote letters of my own to my squad mates' families, telling them about their loved ones' courage and dedication, to the interpreters who risked their lives to help us, expressing gratitude for their sacrifice, to the children in nearby villages who would sometimes wave at our convoys, promising that we were there to help build a better future. I wrote to everyone except my own family, because I was beginning to understand something important. Family isn't defined by blood or shared DNA. It's defined by loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional support. By that definition, I was surrounded by family every day, and they wore the same uniform I did. The breaking point came 6 months later, during what should have been a routine mission. We were escorting a supply convoy through the Spin Boldak region when our lead vehicle hit an IED buried in the road. The explosion flipped the truck, trapping 3 soldiers inside, while insurgents opened fire from concealed positions in the rocks above the road. In that moment, everything my family had tried to take from me, my sense of purpose, my belonging, my worth, crystallized into absolute clarity. I didn't think about my mother's disapproval or my father's rejection or my siblings' indifference. I thought about Corporal Jackson, 19 years old from Alabama, trapped upside down in a burning vehicle. I thought about Specialist Kim, a single mother from Oregon, bleeding from shrapnel wounds and calling for help. I thought about Private Davis, barely 18, whose leg was crushed under twisted metal. I got them out, all of them. While bullets sparked off the rocks around me and the acrid smoke of burning diesel filled my lungs, I pulled my fellow soldiers to safety one by one. When the insurgents tried to advance on our position, I held them off with controlled bursts from my rifle until reinforcements arrived. I did it despite taking shrapnel in my own leg, despite the blood soaking through my uniform, despite knowing that every second increased the risk that we'd all die in that godforsaken mountain pass. I did it because that's what soldiers do for each other. That's what family does. The irony wasn't lost on me as I lay in the medical tent afterward, watching Army surgeons work to save my leg. My real family, the people who had given me life and raised me and supposedly loved me, had spent months trying to destroy my sense of worth and belonging.
But my chosen family, the soldiers who served beside me, had given me a reason to risk everything, to act with courage I didn't know I possessed. As the morphine took hold and the pain faded to a manageable ache, I made myself a promise. I would never again let anyone, blood relative or otherwise, tell me who I was supposed to be or what I was worth. The Morgans had tried to break me by taking away my past and my future. But they couldn't take away what I had become in that burning convoy, or the lives I had saved, or the honor I had earned through my own choices. They thought they had destroyed their wayward daughter. Instead, they had forged something much more dangerous, a soldier who finally understood her own strength. The flight from Ramstein Air Base in Germany to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland was the longest 18 hours of my life. Not because of the physical pain, the morphine took care of most of that, but because of the uncertainty. The doctors had been honest about my prognosis: extensive nerve damage, multiple fractures, and a 70% chance I would lose my leg below the knee. But what terrified me more than the possibility of amputation was the question of what came next. I had joined the Army to escape my family's influence, to build something meaningful with my life. Now, lying in that military transport with my mangled leg suspended in traction, I wondered if I was heading back to the same powerlessness I'd tried so hard to leave behind. Walter Reed was a world unto itself, a sprawling complex where the true cost of American foreign policy was measured not in dollars or geopolitical advantages, but in missing limbs, traumatic brain injuries, and the hollow stares of young people who had aged decades in a matter of months. My ward was filled with soldiers who were learning to navigate a reality none of us had imagined when we raised our right hands and swore our oaths.
The amputation surgery took place on a rainy Thursday morning in October. When I woke up, my left leg ended just below the knee, wrapped in pristine white bandages that seemed to mock the finality of what lay beneath them. The phantom pain was immediate and excruciating, my brain still sending signals to nerve endings that no longer existed, still expecting responses from muscles and bones that had been discarded as medical waste. But it was the silence that hurt most. No calls, no visits, no flowers or cards from the family that had supposedly raised me. While other patients received a steady stream of visitors, parents, siblings, childhood friends who had driven hundreds of miles to offer support, my bedside table remained empty except for official military paperwork and get-well cards from soldiers I'd served with overseas. 3 weeks into my recovery, a social worker named Maria Gonzalez stopped by my room. She was a compact woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen every variety of human suffering. "Sergeant Morgan," she said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside my bed, "I need to ask you about your family situation. We've tried contacting your emergency contacts multiple times, but haven't received any responses. Is there anyone we should be reaching out to?" I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations in the acoustic panels. "There's no one to contact," I said finally. "My family made their position clear before I deployed." Maria's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We have resources, support systems, and people who want to help you transition back to civilian life successfully." She introduced me to a network I never knew existed: disabled veterans who had not just survived their injuries, but had transformed them into sources of strength. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a former Marine sniper who had lost both legs to an IED and now competed in Paralympic cycling. There was Lisa Chen, an Army medic who had lost her right arm and become a renowned prosthetics engineer. There was David Washington, a Navy SEAL who had survived a helicopter crash and now ran a nonprofit helping veterans start their own businesses. These people became my teachers, my mentors, and eventually my friends. They taught me that healing wasn't about returning to who I used to be, it was about becoming someone entirely new. The physical therapy was brutal. Learning to walk again with a prosthetic leg meant retraining every muscle in my body, recalibrating my sense of balance, accepting that simple tasks like climbing stairs or walking on uneven ground would require conscious thought and planning for the rest of my life. There were days when I wanted to quit, when the frustration of falling during what should have been a basic exercise made me question whether the effort was worth it. But my fellow patients wouldn't let me give up. When I struggled with my first prosthetic fitting, Tommy was there to demonstrate advanced techniques he'd learned through years of trial and error. When I broke down crying after a particularly difficult session, Lisa sat with me and shared her own stories of despair and eventual triumph. When I received news that my medical discharge was being expedited, cutting short any possibility of continuing my military career, David helped me understand that my service didn't end just because I could no longer wear the uniform. "You think losing your leg makes you less of a soldier?" he asked me one afternoon as we worked through exercises in the physical therapy gym. "Let me tell you something, Morgan. The uniform doesn't make you a warrior. Your choices do, your character do. And from what I've heard about that convoy in Afghanistan, you've got more warrior spirit in your remaining leg than most people have in their entire bodies." It was David who first suggested I consider law school. We were having coffee in the hospital cafeteria, and I was venting about feeling directionless, about having no idea what to do with the rest of my life. "You've got a sharp mind for analysis," he said. "You care about justice. You understand what it's like to be powerless and what it's like to fight back. Those are exactly the qualities this country needs in its lawyers and judges." The idea seemed impossible at first. I had no money for tuition, no family connections to prestigious schools, and an academic record interrupted by military service. But Maria helped me research veterans' educational benefits, and Tommy introduced me to a scholarship program specifically for disabled veterans pursuing professional degrees. More importantly, my fellow veterans helped me understand that my injury could be an asset rather than a liability.
The discipline I'd learned in the military, the leadership skills I developed under fire, the perspective that came from literal life and death experience, these weren't things you could learn in a classroom. I spent my final months at Walter Reed preparing for the LSAT while completing my physical rehabilitation. Studying was a welcome distraction from the phantom pain that still plagued my nights, and the logic puzzles reminded me that my mind, at least, was still sharp. When my discharge papers finally came through, I scored in the 95th percentile on the exam. But the real transformation wasn't happening in my academic preparation or physical therapy sessions. It was happening in my understanding of who I was and what I was capable of becoming. For 21 years, I had defined myself in relation to my family as the disappointment, the rebel, the expendable daughter. The Army had given me a new identity as a soldier, but even that had been taken from me. Now, for the first time in my life, I was completely free to decide who I wanted to be. Georgetown Law School accepted me with a full scholarship and additional funding for housing and living expenses. The acceptance letter, arriving on a gray February morning, felt like a lifeline thrown across an impossible chasm. I was going to be a lawyer, not because it was expected of me or because it would enhance my family's social standing, but because I had chosen it for myself. My first day of classes was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Walking across the Georgetown campus with my prosthetic leg and my military bearing, I felt like an alien among the other students, most of whom had come straight from undergraduate programs at elite universities, many of whom had never faced real adversity or made life-altering sacrifices for something larger than themselves. But I had advantages they didn't. When constitutional law professors discussed the theoretical balance between individual rights and national security, I could speak from experience about what those concepts meant in practice. When criminal law classes examined police procedures and evidence gathering, I understood the real-world implications of getting those procedures wrong. When we studied veterans' rights and military justice, I wasn't reading about abstract legal principles. I was studying laws that had directly affected my life and the lives of people I'd served with. More importantly, I was learning skills that my family's wealth and connections had never been able to teach me: how to research complex problems methodically, how to build arguments based on evidence rather than influence, how to advocate for people who had no voice in the corridors of power. During my second year, I secured an internship with a nonprofit legal clinic that specialized in veterans affairs. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, helping disabled veterans navigate bureaucratic labyrinths to secure benefits they'd earned, fighting wrongful denials of medical care, advocating for homeless veterans who had fallen through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. It was there that I first encountered cases involving military contractors and the long-term consequences of their negligence. Veterans living in moldy, unsafe housing provided by companies that had cut corners to maximize profits, families dealing with health problems caused by contaminated water or faulty construction, soldiers whose injuries had been made worse by substandard equipment purchased through corrupt procurement processes. Each case felt personal, not just because I understood military life, but because I recognized the system of corruption I had first glimpsed in my own family's business. The same arrogance, the same willingness to sacrifice people's welfare for profit, the same assumption that their victims had no recourse or voice. But I was no longer the powerless 18-year-old who had discovered my family's crimes and been silenced by their threats. I was a law student with research skills, legal training, and a network of contacts throughout the veterans community. I was someone who understood both the system being exploited and the system that could be used to fight back. During my final year of law school, I began to compile a database of military contractor violations, cross-referencing them with corporate ownership records, government contracts, and political donation patterns. What emerged was a picture of systemic corruption that made my family's fraud look like petty theft in comparison. And at the center of it all, growing larger and more profitable each year, was Morgan Development Corporation. The night before graduation, as I sat in my small apartment organizing 3 years' worth of research, I realized that my transformation was complete. I was no longer running from my family or trying to escape their influence. I was preparing to confront them with weapons they had never imagined I would possess:
legal expertise, moral authority, and the unshakable confidence that comes from surviving their worst and becoming stronger because of it. They had tried to break me by taking away my leg, my military career, and my sense of belonging. Instead, they had given me something far more dangerous: a lawyer's training, a warrior's determination, and absolutely nothing left to lose.
3 weeks after passing the bar exam, I received a phone call that changed everything. I was in my new office at Brennan and Associates, a boutique firm specializing in government accountability and whistleblower protection, when my secretary buzzed me. Ms. Morgan, there's a Pentagon official online too. Says it's about your military service record. Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez's voice was exactly as I remembered from our brief meeting months earlier, controlled, precise, and carrying an undertone of barely contained anger. "Counselor Morgan," he said, and I could hear the respect in his new form of address. "I have news. The Medal of Honor recommendation I showed you has been approved at every level. The ceremony is scheduled for next month. But I'm calling because we've discovered something troubling during the final review process." My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of something? "Your original service record has been systematically altered. Awards removed, commendations deleted, witness statements buried. Someone with significant influence has been manipulating your file for years. We're talking about a level of access that suggests involvement from defense contractors with Pentagon connections." I felt my pulse quicken. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was evidence of the kind of corruption I had been researching for my clients. "Colonel, I think I know who's behind this, and I think it's connected to something much larger." That afternoon, I placed a call to Sarah Chen, the journalist who had first approached me about my family's business. She agreed to meet me at a quiet restaurant in Arlington, away from the government buildings where conversations might be overheard. Sarah had aged in the months since our first meeting. Her investigation into military contractor fraud had clearly taken its toll, but her eyes still held the sharp focus of someone who had found the story of her career. "Haley," she said, sliding into the booth across from me, "I'm glad you called. I've been digging deeper into Morgan Development, and what I've found is staggering. Your family isn't just cutting corners on military housing. They're part of a network of contractors that has systematically defrauded the Pentagon for decades." She spread a folder of documents across the table between us: financial records, email chains, phone logs, contractor agreements, a paper trail that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it was almost hard to comprehend. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a spreadsheet of campaign contributions. "Your mother has donated over $2 million to key members of the House and Senate Defense Appropriations subcommittees over the past 5 years. Your father sits on advisory boards for 3 different Pentagon procurement offices. Your brother Marcus has been fast-tracked for security clearances that normally take years to obtain." I studied the documents, my legal training helping me connect the dots. They've built an entire influence network. They don't just win contracts, they help write the specifications for the contracts they're bidding on. "Exactly," Sarah said, "and when whistleblowers try to expose problems, they get shut down through bureaucratic channels before their complaints ever see daylight. Military personnel who file safety reports get transferred. Inspectors who find violations get reassigned. Journalists who ask too many questions find their sources suddenly unwilling to talk." She pulled out another document, a list of names I didn't recognize at first, but which quickly became familiar. They were military personnel who had served at bases with Morgan Development Housing, soldiers who had later experienced career setbacks, medical discharge complications, or benefits disputes. These are all people who filed complaints about housing conditions at Morgan Development projects: mold exposure, electrical problems, contaminated water systems. Every single one of them later experienced problems with their military records, their benefits, or their civilian job prospects. My blood ran cold as I recognized the pattern. The same systematic suppression that had been used against me had been deployed against dozens of other service members, whose only crime was trying to protect their families from unsafe living conditions. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I need to show you something." I opened my briefcase and pulled out 3 years' worth of research, my database of contractor violations, cross-referenced with political donations, contract awards, and military personnel records. Together, our information painted a picture of a corruption network that reached from corporate boardrooms to Pentagon offices to congressional committees. "We need more than documents," I said. "We need witnesses, people willing to go on the record."
That's when Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd known her. I've been hoping you'd say that, because I think I know exactly where to find them. The next phase of our investigation took us to places I never expected to visit as a lawyer. We traveled to military bases across the country, talking to families living in substandard Morgan development housing. We interviewed former employees who had been fired for raising safety concerns. We tracked down military personnel who had been mysteriously transferred after filing complaints.
Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. At Fort Hood, we met Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, whose twin daughters had developed severe asthma after moving into new Morgan development housing, later found to contain toxic mold. When she tried to file a complaint, she was informed that her security clearance was being revoked for reliability concerns that appeared in her file from unknown sources. At Camp Lejeune, we spoke with former construction supervisor Mike Torres, who had been fired from Morgan Development after refusing to sign off on electrical work that didn't meet safety codes. When he tried to report the violations to base authorities, he found that his complaints were being routed through a review process that seemed designed to delay any action indefinitely. In Norfolk, we interviewed Navy families who had been living with contaminated water for months, while Morgan Development claimed the problems were being addressed through appropriate channels. The base housing office had detailed records of repair requests, but somehow those records kept disappearing from official files. But the most important witness came from an unexpected source. I was working late one evening when I received an encrypted email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "From a friend at Morgan Development." The sender identified herself as Linda Martinez, a senior accountant at my family's company. She had been working there for 15 years, long enough to see the evolution from a legitimate construction business to something much more sinister. "I've been following the news about your Medal of Honor," the email read. "I was there when your mother made the calls to suppress your military record. I have the phone logs, the names, the dates. I also have financial records showing payments to Pentagon officials, falsified safety inspection reports, and correspondence proving that your family knew their housing was making people sick and decided to cover it up rather than fix it." She wanted to meet, but only if I could guarantee her protection. As a whistleblower in a major federal fraud case, she would be entitled to certain legal protections, but those protections were only as strong as the institutions enforcing them. Given what we had learned about my family's influence network, that wasn't much reassurance. I spent the next week setting up a secure meeting through the legal clinic's whistleblower protection program. Linda Martinez turned out to be a woman in her early 50s, with the methodical precision of a career accountant and the moral clarity of someone who had finally decided she couldn't be complicit in her employer's crimes any longer. The documents she brought were devastating. Not just financial records showing the systematic overbilling and use of substandard materials, but communications proving that senior Morgan Development executives, including my father and brother, knew their housing was causing health problems and had made a calculated decision that settling occasional lawsuits was cheaper than actually fixing the safety issues. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails between my mother and a Pentagon procurement officer named Colonel Bradley Hayes. The messages showed a clear quid pro quo arrangement. Morgan Development would provide consulting fees to a shell company controlled by Hayes' wife, and in return, Hayes would ensure that safety complaints about Morgan Development projects were handled through internal review processes that would never result in public disclosure or contract penalties. The smoking gun was an email from my mother to Hayes dated just 2 weeks after my convoy incident. The family situation we discussed has been neutralized. H's service record has been adjusted to reflect a more appropriate level of recognition. This should eliminate any potential complications for our ongoing partnership. They hadn't just suppressed my Medal of Honor recommendation to avoid embarrassment. They had traded my military honors like a commodity in their corruption network. Armed with Linda's evidence and Sarah's investigative work, I began preparing a legal strategy that would expose the entire network. But I needed more than just documentation. I needed a way to force the story into public view where my family's influence couldn't suppress it.
That's when I remembered something from my constitutional law classes: the power of congressional oversight. Members of Congress had the authority to demand hearings, to subpoena documents, to compel testimony under oath. And unlike Pentagon bureaucrats or Defense Department officials, elected representatives had to answer to voters who might care about soldiers being poisoned by corrupt contractors. I started reaching out to congressional offices, focusing on members who had military backgrounds or who represented districts with large veteran populations. Most gave me polite brush-offs, but one office responded differently. Congresswoman Maria Santos from Texas was a former Army officer herself, and her district included several military installations. When I explained what we had discovered about military housing fraud and the suppression of service members' records, she agreed to meet immediately. The meeting took place in her Washington office on a Thursday afternoon. Congresswoman Santos was a compact woman in her early 40s with the bearing of someone who had served in combat and the sharp political instincts of someone who had learned to fight bureaucratic battles as well as military ones. I laid out everything we had discovered: the fraud, the corruption network, the suppression of military records, the health impacts on military families. But it was the personal element that seemed to resonate most with her. "They stole your Medal of Honor recommendation," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They traded away your military honors to protect their business interests. That's not just fraud, that's a betrayal of everything we're supposed to stand for."
2 days later, Congresswoman Santos announced that she would be calling for congressional hearings on military contractor fraud and its impact on service member records. The announcement made national news, and for the first time in years, my family's name was associated with a story they couldn't control. The war I had been preparing for was about to begin, and this time I wouldn't be fighting alone. The hearing room in the Rayburn House office building was packed to capacity. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle as members of Congress, journalists, military families, and government officials filled every available seat. The air hummed with anticipation and the weight of long-suppressed truths finally coming to light. I sat at the witness table, my dress uniform crisp and perfect, the empty space where my left leg used to be hidden beneath the polished wood. To my right sat Linda Martinez, nervous but determined, clutching the briefcase full of evidence that would destroy my family's empire. To my left, Sarah Chen reviewed her notes one final time, her months of investigation about to be vindicated on national television. At the defendants' table, though they weren't officially defendants yet, sat the Morgan family. My father, Robert, looked older than his 62 years, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of the accusations hanging over him. My mother, Patricia, maintained her perfect posture and expressionless facade, but I could see the tension in the way her manicured fingers gripped her expensive handbag. Marcus slouched in his chair with practiced indifference, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his nerves. Jessica had wisely stayed away. Her lawyer had advised her that, as someone with minimal involvement in the company, she was better served by maintaining distance. Behind them sat a phalanx of expensive attorneys, the kind of legal firepower that unlimited money could buy. They had spent weeks trying to prevent these hearings, filing motions, calling in political favors, and threatening lawsuits against anyone involved in the investigation. But Congresswoman Santos had stood firm, backed by a bipartisan coalition of representatives who understood that military contractor fraud affected their constituents regardless of party affiliation. The committee chairman, Representative William Hayes, no relation to the corrupted Pentagon official, called the hearing to order. He was a former Marine colonel from North Carolina, and his opening statement set the tone for everything that would follow. "We are here today," he began, his voice carrying across the silent chamber, "to examine allegations of the most serious nature. Allegations that American contractors, entrusted with housing our military families, have not only defrauded the taxpayers, but have systematically suppressed the voices of service members who tried to expose their crimes. If these allegations prove true, we are looking at a betrayal of trust that strikes at the very heart of our military's ability to protect and serve this nation." Congresswoman Santos was the first to question the witnesses, and she began with Linda Martinez.
The accountant's testimony was methodical, devastating, and impossible to dismiss. She walked the committee through 15 years of financial records, showing exactly how Morgan Development had overbilled the Pentagon, used substandard materials, and falsified inspection reports. In 2019 alone, Martinez testified, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing, Morgan Development charged the Department of Defense $47 million for materials that cost them $23 million to purchase. The difference was pure profit, extracted from funds intended to provide safe housing for military families. She produced email chains showing company executives joking about creative accounting and referring to Pentagon inspectors as useful idiots. She showed photographs of toxic mold in military housing that Morgan Development knew about but chose not to remediate because the costs would cut into their profit margins. But the most damning evidence came when Santos asked about my family's knowledge of the health impacts their housing was causing. Martinez pulled out a memo dated 3 years earlier, authored by my father and circulated to senior staff. The document acknowledged that their housing construction methods were causing respiratory problems in military families, but concluded that the legal costs of occasional settlements were an acceptable business expense compared to the capital costs of construction improvements. A collective gasp went through the hearing room. Several committee members looked visibly shaken. They were looking at written proof that my father had knowingly chosen profit over the health of the men and women who served their country. When it was my turn to testify, I stood carefully, my prosthetic leg supporting me as I raised my right hand to take the oath. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family that had tried to silence my voice was now forced to listen as I spoke under the protection of congressional immunity. Honorable committee members, I began, looking directly at the cameras that would carry my words to millions of Americans. My name is Captain Haley Morgan, and I am here today not just as a witness, but as a victim of the corruption we are examining. I told them about the convoy attack, about my actions that saved 7 lives, about the Medal of Honor recommendation that had been systematically suppressed. I explained how my own family had traded away my military honors to protect their business relationships with corrupt Pentagon officials. They didn't just steal money from taxpayers, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. They stole the recognition that my fellow soldiers earned through their blood and sacrifice. They turned the honors system that motivates our military into a commodity to be traded for business favors. I introduced the email evidence showing my mother's correspondence with Colonel Hayes, the Pentagon official who had buried my commendation in exchange for consulting fees. I showed the committee phone logs proving that Patricia Morgan had made over 30 calls to various Defense Department offices in the weeks following my injury, each call designed to minimize my service record and prevent recognition of my actions. When Representative Davis from Ohio asked why my family would go to such lengths to suppress my military record, I looked directly at my parents for the first time since entering the room. Because, I said, a decorated war hero asking questions about military contractor fraud would have been impossible to ignore. A broken, forgotten daughter with no credibility could be dismissed. They tried to turn me into someone whose voice didn't matter. My mother's mask finally cracked. Her perfect composure dissolved, and I saw something I had never seen before: genuine fear. Not fear of legal consequences or financial ruin, but fear of exposure, of having the world see what she really was beneath the charitable donations and society page appearances. The committee then called my parents to testify. Their attorneys had advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights, but Congresswoman Santos had made it clear that refusing to answer questions would be seen as an admission of guilt by both the committee and the viewing public. My father went first, his usual corporate confidence nowhere to be found. When Representative Santos asked him directly about the mold contamination in military housing, he tried to deflect. These are complex construction issues, he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Sometimes environmental factors beyond our control. Mr. Morgan, Santos interrupted, we have an internal memo in your own handwriting acknowledging that your construction methods were causing health problems. You wrote, and I quote, "Settlement costs are acceptable compared to remediation expenses." How do you explain that? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before my father's attorney whispered something in his ear. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Robert Morgan said quietly. The hearing room erupted. Journalists scribbled frantically, committee members exchanged shocked looks, and the cameras captured every moment of my father's legal and moral collapse. My mother's testimony was even more devastating. When asked about her role in suppressing my military record, she tried to maintain her dignified facade. "I was protecting my family," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "My daughter made choices that put our business at risk. I did what any mother would do." Representative Hayes leaned forward. "Mrs. Morgan, are you saying that any mother would call Pentagon officials to suppress their daughter's Medal of Honor recommendation?" Patricia's composure finally shattered completely. "She chose those soldiers over her own family," she screamed, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "She chose strangers over the people who raised her, who loved her, who gave her everything. She deserved what happened to her." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The hearing room fell completely silent, except for the whir of television cameras recording my mother's public confession that she had destroyed my military career out of pure spite. Congresswoman Santos seized the moment. "Mrs. Morgan, you just admitted on national television that you deliberately sabotaged your daughter's military record because she chose to serve her country instead of protecting your business interests. Do you understand what you just confessed to?" My mother realized what she had done. The color drained from her face as she understood that her outburst had just provided the smoking gun that investigators needed. She had confessed to corruption, to betraying military personnel, to trading away national honors for personal vengeance. The hearings concluded with a unanimous committee vote to refer the matter to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. Within hours, FBI agents were executing search warrants at Morgan development offices across the country. By evening, federal prosecutors had unsealed indictments against my parents, my brother, and 16 other individuals in their corruption network. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later when I received a call from the White House. The president's military aide informed me that my Medal of Honor ceremony would be rescheduled for the following month, and that the president personally wanted to apologize for the years of delay. "The president also wanted me to tell you," the aide said, "that your family's attempts to suppress your record have only made your heroism more evident. Anyone willing to stand up to that level of corruption and retaliation clearly has the moral courage our nation needs." That night, I sat in my apartment watching news coverage of my parents being led away in handcuffs. For the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten: peace. Not because I had won, though I had, but because the truth was finally free.
They had tried to erase me, to make me disappear, to turn me into someone whose voice didn't matter. Instead, they had created their own worst nightmare: a witness with unshakable credibility, legal expertise, and absolutely nothing left to fear from them. The war was over, and justice had finally found its way home. The East Room of the White House had hosted many ceremonies over the decades, but few carried the weight of vindication that filled the air on that crisp November morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows as military personnel, government officials, and invited guests took their seats. At the front of the room, the President of the United States stood ready to correct a years-long injustice. I entered the room in my dress blue uniform, my prosthetic legs steady beneath me, my spine straight with the confidence that comes from having survived everything your enemies could throw at you. The Medal of Honor ribbon box sat on a small table beside the podium, containing the recognition that had been stolen from me and was finally being returned. In the front row sat my chosen family, the veterans from Walter Reed who had taught me how to transform pain into strength, the lawyers from the clinic who had helped me build the case that brought down a corruption network, Sarah Chen with her notebook ready to document this moment of justice. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez sat in full dress uniform, his satisfaction evident as he prepared to witness the ceremony he had fought years to make possible. But it was the conspicuous absence in that room that spoke loudest of all. The Morgan family section remained empty. My parents were in federal prison awaiting sentencing, my brother Marcus faced 23 criminal charges, and Jessica had publicly disavowed any connection to the family business. The people who had raised me were no longer part of my life, not because they had abandoned me this time, but because I had finally stopped needing their approval. The president's remarks were brief but powerful. He spoke about sacrifice, about the true meaning of heroism, and about the courage required not just to save lives in combat, but to stand up to corruption even when it came from within one's own family. Captain Morgan, he said, turning to face me directly, your actions on that convoy in Afghanistan were heroic by any measure. But your actions in exposing the corruption that tried to bury that heroism required a different kind of courage. The courage to fight for truth even when the cost was everything you had left to lose. As he placed the Medal of Honor around my neck, I felt the weight of more than just medal and ribbon. I felt the weight of vindication, of justice finally served, of a promise kept to every soldier whose voice had been silenced by corrupt officials and compromised systems. The ceremony concluded with full military honors, but the real resolution came in the weeks that followed. The Morgan Development Corporation was dissolved by federal order, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the military families who had been harmed by their fraud. The contaminated housing projects were demolished and rebuilt to proper standards. The corrupted Pentagon officials faced their own criminal trials. More importantly, Congress passed the Military Housing Safety Act, legislation requiring independent oversight of all military contractor housing, establishing whistleblower protections for service members who report safety violations, and creating a victims' compensation fund for families affected by contractor negligence. But the most meaningful outcome was personal. 3 months after the medal ceremony, I received a letter that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. It was from Specialist Kim, one of the soldiers I had saved during the convoy attack. Captain Morgan, the letter began, I wanted you to know that my daughter just started her sophomore year at college. She's studying engineering, and she says she wants to build things that keep people safe instead of putting them in danger. She knows that she has that opportunity because you made sure her mom came home alive. Your family tried to erase what you did for us, but we never forgot. None of us ever forgot. I kept that letter on my desk as I transitioned into a new phase of my life. The law firm had offered me a partnership track, recognizing that my unique combination of military experience, legal expertise, and proven integrity made me valuable in ways that couldn't be taught in any classroom. My first major case involved representing military families in a class action lawsuit against another defense contractor, one whose executives had clearly not learned the lessons of the Morgan development scandal. The depositions, negotiations, and courtroom advocacy felt like a natural extension of the mission I had begun in that Afghan convoy, protecting the people who serve our country from those who would exploit or harm them. But it was the personal relationships I'd built during this journey that provided the deepest satisfaction. David Washington, the former SEAL who had encouraged me to attend law school, became not just a mentor but a true friend. When he asked me to serve on the board of his nonprofit organization helping veterans start their own businesses, I accepted immediately. Tommy Rodriguez, the Marine sniper turned Paralympic athlete, invited me to join his training group. Learning to compete in adaptive sports with my prosthetic leg became a source of joy I never expected to find. The physical challenges reminded me daily that limitations exist only in our minds, and that the strongest people are often those who have learned to rebuild themselves from the ground up. Lisa Chen, the former Army medic turned prosthetics engineer, collaborated with me on advocating for better VA services for disabled veterans. Together, we testified before Congress about the need for improved prosthetic technology and mental health support for wounded warriors. The hearings were nothing like the adversarial confrontation with my family. These were conversations between people united by a common purpose. Perhaps most surprisingly, I found myself developing a relationship with Jessica. My younger sister had reached out 6 months after our parents' convictions, tentatively asking if we might be able to rebuild some kind of connection. She had legally changed her name, donated her trust fund to military family charities, and was working as a teacher in an inner-city school in Detroit. "I can't undo what I failed to do when we were younger," she said during our first phone call in years. "I knew Mom and Dad were wrong, but I was too scared to stand up to them. I watched them destroy you, and I did nothing." Our relationship was cautious, limited, and bore no resemblance to the sisterhood we might have had in different circumstances. But it was honest in ways that our family connections had never been before. Jessica had chosen to reject the corruption and privilege that had defined our childhood, and that choice meant something, even if it came too late to change our past. The legal consequences for my family were severe, but appropriate. Robert Morgan received 12 years in federal prison for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Patricia Morgan got 8 years for her role in the corruption network and an additional 2 years for obstruction of justice related to suppressing military records. Marcus faced 15 years for his active participation in multiple schemes and his role in covering up safety violations that had directly harmed military families. The financial penalties were equally devastating. The family fortune, built over decades of government contracts, was wiped out by criminal forfeiture, civil judgments, and restitution payments. The Lake Forest mansion was sold to pay victims. The art collection, the cars, the jewelry, the symbols of wealth and status that had once seemed so important, all of it was liquidated to compensate the people they had harmed. But for me, the most satisfying resolution came not from their punishment, but from my own transformation. On the second anniversary of the Medal of Honor ceremony, I stood before a graduating class of wounded warriors at Walter Reed, delivering a speech about resilience, purpose, and the choice between bitterness and growth. "Some of you," I told them, "have been betrayed by people you trusted. Some have been abandoned by families who couldn't handle your injuries. Some have been told that your best days are behind you, that your wounds make you less than whole." I looked out at the faces in the audience, young men and women who had sacrificed parts of their bodies for their country and were now learning to rebuild their lives around new realities. I'm here to tell you that the people who say those things are wrong. Your wounds are not weaknesses. They are proof of your strength. Your scars are not disfigurements. They are evidence of your courage. And the people who abandon you in your darkest moments reveal their own character, not yours. I paused, thinking of the journey that had brought me to this podium, from the wine cellar where I had almost died to this room where I was helping others choose life. You get to decide who you become next. You get to choose whether your pain makes you bitter or makes you stronger. You get to determine whether your story ends with what was done to you or begins with what you choose to do with the rest of your life. After the speech, a young soldier approached me, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, with burns covering half his face and an empty sleeve where his right arm used to be. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the speech, but for showing us that it's possible to win, that the people who hurt us don't get to have the last word." I looked at this young warrior, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of pain and determination that I remembered from my own darkest days. And I realized something profound. My family had tried to destroy me, but they had actually given me the greatest gift imaginable. They had taught me that my worth came from my choices, not my circumstances. That my strength came from my character, not my connections. That my value came from what I could give to others, not what others could give to me. "You're absolutely right," I told them. "They don't get the last word. We do. And our last word is going to be about how we chose to build something beautiful from the pieces they left behind." Walking out of Walter Reed that day, I felt complete in a way I had never experienced during my privileged childhood. I had a career that mattered, relationships built on mutual respect and shared values, and a sense of purpose that came from using my pain to prevent others from suffering the same injustices. The Morgans had tried to write me out of their story. Instead, I had written them out of mine, and the story I was writing now, with my chosen family, my meaningful work, and my hard-won wisdom, was far better than anything they could have given me. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from getting what we always wanted, but from discovering that what we always wanted was never worthy of us in the first place.
Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you, right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.